Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Doom, and this week we're welcoming in a first-time guest. This is Brandon Schexnayder. He's a storyteller, a podcaster, and he's the host of the Southern Gothic podcast. And he's going to talk to us today about ghost stories and haunted history and all sorts of stuff, because 'tis the season, is it not? So, Brandon, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. So, tell the folks a little bit about yourself.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm a podcaster, and like you said, I like to tell ghost stories. I have a show called Southern Gothic, which was doing all the apps and everything. And the show's about 6 years old. We've been exploring old Southern folklore, ghost stories, haunted places, historic true crime, things of that nature. And we put that on every other week.
That's great. That's excellent. So at some point I'm going to ask you some of the scariest ones, but what got you down this path?
Yeah, well, I grew up down in New Orleans, so just kind of, the vibe down there, right? Yeah. It's in the air. But honestly, when I was growing up down there, my parents were into like genealogy and all, and this was pre-ancestry, pre-internet, right? Mm-hmm. Pre-ancestry.com and pre-internet. So what that meant was it meant that they used to drag my sister and I to cemeteries every weekend. Okay? And so, they just, I don't think they realized what they did, but they just got their kids into some weird stuff that way, right? But so I kind of grew up, growing up in New Orleans, going to cemeteries, things of that nature. Kind of early on was into kind of some of the macabre things and that stuff. And when I got a little older, just really fell in love with stories and research and things of that nature. And Southern Gothic was born.
Yeah, but cemeteries are very different in certain cultures and certain cities than they are in others. Like me growing up, cemetery, you went to a cemetery when somebody died, or occasionally on the anniversary of their death, or, very rare occasions. Even now as an adult, the same thing. But I'm in Baltimore, there's Greenmount Cemetery, which is pretty historic. And of course, there's the Edgar Allan Poe Museum, and there's a small cemetery there, which may or may not have Poe's crypt in it, and there's tours, so there's that. But like Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, a lot, there's cities that just like cemeteries are part of the landscape and part of the lifescape, and they're not part of the deathscape. They're not something to be shunned. They're front and center. So I don't know. I think for your parents, not that they need defending, but I think that seems like a very New Orleans thing to do.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating when you go through how, especially when you go through a cemetery where your family came from, your family being here hundreds of years or something, right? When you walk through and you see the names that are all your ancestors and see these small little country cemeteries, essentially, you really understand what it is you're looking at better, when it kind of comes that way. But I tell people today, what is fascinating about going to cemeteries, whether you have family in them or not, and I frequent them all the time. I love traveling to some of the places we talk about. And when you go through and you look at those tombstones, what you don't realize is you have a lifetime of stories just every couple of feet.
Right.
Every tombstone is a lifetime of stories. And that's what really is fascinating.
And I hear people yelling at me out there in the ether saying, well, Arlington and all the war cemeteries and Civil War cemeteries. Yeah, I'm sort of putting, those sort of occupy their own class and status.
Sure, yeah. We actually just did an episode recently on Arlington and how it was made out of Robert E. Lee's wife's family, his in-laws' family home is the property that Arlington was made on. So, yeah.
Wow. Oh, well, that's turning something, I guess, eminent domain. We'll just call it that. Just a polite way of saying taking someone else's stuff.
Well, they thought he was a traitor, so they wanted to make sure they ruined the land, of course, right?
Yeah, well, they turned him venerated, and I think he actually fits the definition of traitor. I mean, traitor's thrown around a lot, and it's a sliding scale. We're recording this on September 17, 2023, so there's a lot of debate whether Elon Musk is a traitor or not, and I don't want to get into that, and whether he should be tried for treason. Like treason's a very specific thing, but you can think someone's treasonous without them being eligible for conviction or charging under treason. Conviction's another thing. But yeah, I think when you were actually the top general of the army rebelling against its own country, that one's pretty much a slam dunk case. So
the U.S. Army, the Army quartermaster, was looking for grounds for they were running out of places to bury the dead in D.C. Right over the Potomac, there's Robert E. Lee's in-laws' family home. Well, let's bury them in the Rose Garden right there. And Miss Mary Lee will never be able to come back, and that is sure enough what they did.
I had no idea. Now, when I went to Arlington, which has been on two occasions, once when I was younger with my parents, much younger, because I'm a middle-aged man eligible for AARP and to live in those communities you see advertised for blank and older. But I don't remember that part of it, but it might just be that I don't remember that part of it, as opposed to that they didn't tell me. All right, enough about that. So let's get into some of haunted history. When you say haunted history, where are you talking about? The U.S. haunted history, North America, worldwide? Where does your haunted history start?
Well, what I typically do with Southern Gothic specifically is I stick to the American South. So I kind of stick to this region in and of itself. And I find it interesting being able to stick to this region as opposed to growing worldwide and really doing everything, is I kind of have this one little segment of time to work with. I've got 400 to 500 years of kind of European colonization in North America. And it's unique because in this period of time, you have all these European countries that are trying to colonize. You have the British on the coast, you have the French in Louisiana, the Spanish in Florida and over in Texas, and they're all colonizing at the same time. There's indigenous people who have lived here for years and native cultures here, and then you kind of pull in, the African slave trade kind of getting brought over here.
And the Dutch, don't forget the worst, the Dutch.
I mean, all of these folks, they're all just kind of cramming in to this one part of the continent all at once and trying to carve out their own space. And as most folks know who know American history, this of course caused a lot of problems that even continue on today. So it's pretty fertile ground for a lot of old violent stories, a lot of stories that have a background in different cultures and stories that have kind of mutated and evolved from whether it's in the Scott-Irish out in Apalachia or old French folklore down in Louisiana and things of that nature. So I stick to the South with Southern Gothic, and how we define the South it's kind of up to the listener there as to where it ends and where it begins.
That's fine. I mean, I live in Maryland, as people have figured out already, and the Mason-Dixon line is between Maryland and Pennsylvania. So if you think that Pennsylvania is where the North starts and Maryland is where the South begins, good on you. You know, I'd say at this point it's at least somewhere below the 3 counties that surround Washington D.C. I mean, it's at least somewhere below Arlington, Alexandria, and Fairfax. I would throw Loudoun County in there also. You know, though Loudoun starts to get southern. Anyway, like you said, it's up to the listener. And how far west does that extend? That also is very much up to the listener. So I guess the scope of, I'm just going to call it jurisdiction, is basically 1492 through present.
Sure. Yeah. Anything in that range. You know, we'll cover some native folklore as well, but honestly, a lot of that, what we find is it's folks' interpretation. You know, it's people of European ancestry interpreting, you know, old Veda. We don't really have a lot of just pure, this came from indigenous people, and that's probably just our own historian and our own, you know, our own history and our own documentation's sake, you know.
So all of those tales where I hear from people that are saying, well, this tribe or this tribe in their legends, there was this white tribe that did this and built this. You think that was maybe just the European spin on the retelling?
Well, you know, it depends. And a lot of it is dependent on where it comes from, right? So what we get in a lot of places, there's the Singing River of Pascagoula is a good example. So there's a river down in Mississippi, right? You know, and the folklore is that this river will sing, right? You're quiet, you hear it. And there's just old folklore surrounding it that at one point in time, there was a tribe that lived there, a native tribe who lived there. And they were something, and I forgot the exact nature of the story, but I believe it was something where it was a Romeo and Juliet type story where, you know, someone fell in love with someone from another tribe. They ran off with the daughter. And of course, that meant now that this other tribe was going to come and enslave them. They were going to come and they would fight them, kill them, or enslave them, something of that nature. So what the tribe ended up deciding to do was, they couldn't fight this off, and they were not going to be enslaved, so they just walked into the river, and they just, you know, committed suicide as a mass suicide into the river. And, you know, and as we trace this story back, it's got this modern telling that if you're down in Mississippi and you talk about the Singing River, you'll hear these stories about it, right? But as we go back in time and we look and we find where it's been published over the years, it kind of changes every time you get a little closer and closer. And we find that this story, this particular story, if I remember correctly, someone documented it I believe in the 18th century, someone who was visiting down there, documented this story from a tribe that said it was actually the story from a previous tribe that had been there before them.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what I find, whether it's indigenous folklore, whether even it's our own folklore, and it's folks who settled Mississippi from, you know, French or Spanish or anything in that nature, it's a game of telephone. It's a game of telephone where just every oral tradition kind of moves on, and each step along the way, the story just changes slightly, whether or not it's the culture at that point in time that does it, whether or not it starts getting published in books, maybe when book publishing becomes mass marketable, whether it then hits the TV shows, whether it hits podcasts, every single step along the way, you know, we kind of can watch these stories evolve.
It's really also biblical. It's Masada.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the tale of Masada. I have heard a similar story with a river, like I think it's the Three Sisters, and they drown crossing a river, and they turned into 3 rocks. And I believe that's also a Native American story. I wonder if it's a variation of the same story or just a similar tale. I mean, people die in the water all the time, and you know, I guess if that's probably as bad a way to commit suicide as any.
Right. Yeah. There's so many. Up by Asheville, North Carolina, there's the French Broad River, and supposedly there's this old story of a siren who lives in there and likes to call men into the river and travelers in. And I don't believe that actually is of native origin, but when you hear the telling, people talk about it as being something that's been told for generations and generations.
Well, if there are sirens, there's no reason that we should think that they just stayed in the Mediterranean or thereabouts and didn't go anywhere else. I mean, why wouldn't there be sirens all over the place? In fact, if they were in fact real and lots of the world was habitable, I mean, I would. I mean, there's sailors and men that you can lead astray all over the place. I mean, one thing I know about men is that they can be led astray. I mean, having been led astray myself a time or two. So, but I really like the ones that fascinate me the most are the ones where it's not they were always there. Like I know that the Aztecs and they say that the Olmecs were always there. I like the ones that say we were always here, like the Aborigines in Australia, and I think it's the Hopi who say we were always here, or the ones before them were always here. I think the Anasazi maybe, but those are the ones that are fascinating, saying we were always here, because always is a long, long time, and it keeps on, with archaeology, the perspective of what's always keeps moving back. I mean, there's always that pesky question of indigenous. What's indigenous? If there was always people before you, then when did we? Were we bad to the bone? Basically from the beginning, or when the mean angels corrupted us or whatever. But I'm going astray. I'm going back into my usual meanderings on Garden of Doom. I want to stick to yours. So tell me what were like some of the stories you heard that you said, I'm gonna pursue this, and this ultimately this is your career. I mean, this is like your job, right?
Yeah. I obviously I'd heard a lot growing up down in New Orleans area, and now I live in Tennessee. I live up by Nashville, so we've got the Bell Witch here. We've got these kind of classic stories, and down in New Orleans, obviously classic stories in here. Marie Laveau, and we mentioned voodoo earlier and all. So a lot of these stories, what inspired me is hearing a story, let's say like the Bell Witch, and hearing that story and not understanding really what it was. Right. So I joke and I say what I try and do now with Southern Gothic is you probably heard something from your mama growing up, and she told you, watch out down there or else the Bell Witch is going to get you. But you never really knew the complexity of some of these tales. So one of the early ones for us, obviously we lived down close to the Myrtles Plantation. That was right outside of Baton Rouge in St. Francisville. That was when we heard a lot about growing up. It's this really haunted place. We also got really invested in the story of a woman named Julia Brown who lived out in Manchac Swamp, which is about halfway between New Orleans and Baton Rouge. And purportedly, Julia Brown, she practiced voodoo out there living in the swamp, and purportedly she destroyed the town of Frenier. She cursed the town and destroyed it with a hurricane after she died. And so we heard this story as well, and ones like that, and just, we're fascinated with finding out more about it. And researching deeper into what's real and what isn't, and which parts of these stories have evolved. Like I said earlier, which parts of these stories have taken on a life of their own? Which parts of these stories have gone into a TV show and just been kind of massaged to make it fit TV,
right?
Or a podcast, or YouTube, or something of that nature. So those were some of the main ones when we started that we thought about. It was like the Myrtles, Julia Brown, and the Bell Witch.
Okay. All right. Any vampires, werewolves, and Bigfoots?
Well, I don't do a lot of cryptids. I'm certainly a middle-aged dad who loves watching Bigfoot TV shows, but I don't do a lot on my show. It's like I don't want to ruin my enjoyment of Bigfoot by studying it, right? But I do. Being from New Orleans, I, of course, we grew up with a lot of vampire folklore. We've talked about some on the show before. New Orleans is chock full of vampires. One in particular, we recently did an episode on a gentleman by the name of Jacques Saint-Germain, Saint-Germain, if you want to, Frenchify it, right? And essentially, it was a late 19th century gentleman who came to New Orleans and purportedly was a vampire, and it kind of goes along the tradition of Comte Saint-Germain. If you've ever heard of that story, the purported he was either a time traveler or he was an immortal man in Europe who, who duped kings into thinking that he knew 7 languages. And New Orleans has its own version of that in Jacques Saint Germain, and a lot of other stories around town with vampires.
Might be the same guy.
Exactly, and that's what New Orleans people report. And it's a beautiful way. The story is central in the French Quarter. If you walk through the French Quarter, I mean, it is stories every other house, right? And if you stand at this one street corner down there, and you stand at this one street corner, it is wild how much the French Quarter, holds in it, because you can stand at this corner and you look one direction, about a block down, and you can see the Ursuline Convent, the old Ursuline Convent. And that's purportedly where the first vampires came to North America.
Oh,
okay. It's purportedly back in I believe it was 1721. I might have the date wrong. We're talking very beginning of New Orleans. The King of France sent over a group of young women to marry to the colonists there in New Orleans. They were marrying age, right? It's up in the air whether or not they were orphaned, there were problems. This is one of those things that depends on who you ask, and the historians and the folklore. But the story goes that they actually came over and brought with them caskets. Okay, whether or not they were vampires themselves or they brought vampires with them, we don't know. So if you stand on this one street corner, you can see exactly where they purportedly lived in the convent. Then you look the other direction down the street corner in the French Quarter, and you'll see there's the house of Madame Lalaurie right there, and the infamous woman who mistreated her enslaved people, and her husband possibly did experiments, and they burned the house down. But it could be America's first serial killer. Sometimes she's billed. And then you look down the road in the other direction, and you're 2 houses away from the famous trunk murders, where those are purported hauntings. But right there on that same street corner is this beautiful house, this beautiful corner house, and it's got some beautiful red doors. And this is where Jacques Saint Germain purportedly lived. And the tale has gone around that he lived here. He lived there, and he was a high-class nobleman, just like the Comte Saint Germain would be. And he came to New Orleans and started having these big parties and everything. And just obviously he was charming, and he was just the belle of the ball, right? Mm-hmm. And everybody wanted to come hang out with him, and he'd feed people and have these parties there. But of course, everybody knew that he never actually ate at his parties or anything, right? He just kind of stood in the corner and he told stories, and he'd kind of drink some wine, right? Well, one morning after one of these big parties, there's a big disturbance down there in the French Quarter, because this woman came jumping, or was thrown out of, either way, of a window on the second floor of this house where he lived, came crashing down onto the street. She's screaming and yelling, and of course the cops get called. She comes and she's trying to get away, and she's claiming that that Jacques in there had tried to bite her, and that he was trying to drink her blood, right? And that she just narrowly gotten away from him. And of course the cops, here's this nobleman, right, with a lot of money. They're like, this is hooey, right? They go knock on the door and they say, look, we're going to have to, we need to look around. And he says, okay, well, come down to the station, something of this nature, right? We're going to have to question you about it. And they take the woman off to get taken care of. But when they come back later, because he doesn't come to answer questions, his door's open and he's gone.
Right.
And they go inside this house, and what they find nothing's there. He's disappeared and everything. But down in his wine cellar, there's all these bottles of wine. And when they open up one of those bottles of wine, they realize that it's actually blood.
All right.
That's right, because this is what he's been drinking. So if you go down to the French Quarter to this day, you can see this beautiful, beautiful house. And up there on the second floor, where it's got that just classic Spanish architectural, French Quarter, the giant windows that go down all the way down to the ground, up maybe about 8 feet. Well, where 2 of them should be, they're bricked over. And purportedly they're bricked over because one of those was one of the windows where that woman had come crashing out.
I say. See, this is a story that could be remade right now, and it would have a great audience. Can you imagine the human trafficking tied to the nobility or the elite, which is just a cover for the human trafficking? Is just a cover for vampires. For the actual vampire trafficking.
Well, Jacques, it's funny. I personally, we haven't found a lot where this story really goes that far back. I don't really know if it. Honestly, I think it's Anne Rice's fault, and that this character kind of has a lot of similarities between Lestat, and Anne Rice being down in New Orleans
without the rage. But yeah. No, you're right. It's Dracula who likes to socialize, and
totally. That kind of not the kind of inhuman vampires, the really fancy.
Right, he's still wanted to be part of humanity, or at least that was his preferred method of hunting. He'd find the drunkest and the most alonest, or whatever. But I really like the human trafficking as a cover for vampire trafficking. Not that I'm in favor of human trafficking. I just mean as a plot point, as a story. Gotta be very careful these days with what you say, even me. All right, so moving on from vampires, I know that that's not really your thing. What are some of the, what are some of like the scariest or most gruesome or most memorable horror stories that once you stumbled upon those, you're like, or found them, you said, yeah, this is me. This is the path that I want to follow.
Right. Well, as I mentioned the Bell Witch earlier, that was definitely one that, the Bell Witch is considered the only spirit to ever kill a human, actually. Okay. Right? From the afterlife, purportedly poisoned John Bell Sr. In the afterlife, and that was one. Recently, actually, was out in Charleston. We were talking about cemeteries earlier, and got to go visit a cemetery out there where a woman by the name of Julia Legree was buried. And this particular story was one that I did early on that I really enjoyed, and it was a young woman. Her family had a plantation out there outside of Charleston on Edisto Island. It was a beautiful, if you can picture what Charleston, that area looks like with the moss-covered trees and the beautiful waterways, and this island was essentially all plantations. Mm-hmm. These rich families, they were all giant plantations, right? And Julia and her family, Julia and her family owned a couple of plantations in that area. Julia married into the Legree family. She was very young at that point in time. I want to say she was about 20. And they were out there on the plantation. She had a young daughter at that point. They were out there on the plantation, and she fell ill. And she got sick, and, they're trying to treat her. And, of course, call a doctor into town, and she got sick. And at some point, she passed away from the illness, right? And so they decided, well, we're out here in the heat and humidity of the summer. We're going to have to rush this. We're going to have to rush her and bury her because we want to do this before her body decomposes. So they go ahead and they take her down to the cemetery that I visited. It's the Edisto Presbyterian Church, and a beautiful cemetery. Again, a beautiful, beautiful church out front, beautiful small cemetery, and this just beautiful, moss-covered oak trees, pure Charleston looking. They bury her out there, have a funeral, and they go on about their life. Right?
Panic at the Disco.
Yeah, exactly. So what folks start saying, though, not long after, is that when they're at the cemetery, they hear the sound of a woman crying, echoing through the cemetery from time to time. And they hear a sound, for weeks, they kind of hear this sound of a woman crying. And, but they go about their life. And then several years later, Julia's brother passes away. And same thing, right? They're going to go and they're going to bury him in the family tomb. Now, this is a beautiful red mausoleum with a big, it was a big concrete door, a big marble door, right? And so they're going to go and they're going to bury him. And when they go to open the big marble door, they are stunned to see bones crash down in front of them onto the ground. And Julia wasn't dead when they buried her there. And all those years, she had been scratching on the walls and screaming to try and get out. And she actually passed away in the cemetery. So it's a pretty chilling thought to see those. But you're opening this thing because you are you are obviously laying to rest a young man with his sister in this mausoleum. Well, years go on, of course, and eventually they started having some odd occurrences at this old cemetery, the Legree family mausoleum, because what they soon found was the door to the cemetery, or the door to the mausoleum, would no longer stay closed. So every time they'd shut and lock this door, it would just open back up. And, everybody thinks this, of course, this is Julia, right? She does not want to be locked in this mausoleum any longer. She's had her injustice at this point. And so eventually that door was just taken off entirely. So when I went down to visit, you can now walk in and you can actually pay your respects within the mausoleum itself and actually see exactly where Julia was buried and look at the walls and imagine what it would be like to be buried alive out there in Charleston.
They didn't bury a skeleton key with her, did they? This is just ghost powers.
Yeah, just ghost powers doing that. Yeah. So it's that one kind of the buried alive stories certainly freak me out.
Yeah,
I think there's certainly ones. We've had several over the years. George Washington himself was afraid of getting buried alive, which is wild. Some of his last words were him asking folks to not bury him for a week because they didn't want. He was so concerned that they would, bury him prematurely.
What do you think? After 3 days, he'd be resurrected?
Well, what would happen is they'd get these diseases, whether it be yellow fever or something, and their breath would just get so quiet, right? And they would hurry up to bury him because, again,
it's contagious.
Vomiting at that point, right? And they would hurry up because they didn't want the body to decay, and would do that. In Julia's case, within 2 days, they did not want to leave that body out to cause problems and rigor mortis set in also. So this was a common fear. You mentioned Poe earlier, right? I mean, he certainly capitalized on it as well.
Yeah, I didn't know George Washington was so afraid of that. I mean, I obviously medical technology has come a long way, but to not be able to tell the difference between dead and alive is, sort of a baseline thing that I think that people will be able to tell just by, putting your finger under someone's nose or, putting a glass or a mirror up to their mouth. And, I guess not.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly something to be afraid of, no matter what, right?
Yeah. I mean, there were lots of things that when I was a kid, I thought were going to be much bigger problems. They turned out to be. I mean, scorpions, quicksands, animal revolutions, things like that I thought were, forthcoming. Buried alive might be in one of those, but to know that George Washington feared that way. I mean, were there soldiers that they buried too quickly on the battlefield?
I don't know of any stories about that right there. I do know of a couple. There's one. Oh gosh, unfortunately I cannot remember the name. But there's one out in Kentucky that was a gentleman who was so afraid of it. He thought he was so afraid of it that there were specialty caskets that were made that would have a bell going all the way up to the ground. So you go out to the cemetery, and if he was buried alive, he could
do a little bell.
This little bell remind people.
So in the darkness, realizing that you're buried alive, you would somehow know that there's a little pull string that you would not panic, and you would pull the little bell, or maybe you'd hit it by accident eventually.
Yeah.
Footman! It's like Lord Grantham there.
Come save me.
Yeah. And I mean, how much air is in, how much time air is in the typical coffin for, let's just say, a Victorian age, wealthy person?
Oh gosh, I don't know, to be honest.
Neither do I. I mean, I can't imagine it's more than a day or two. But I mean, that's not a very good story, is it? I mean, Julia, it sounds like she was in there for a long, long time.
Well, she was buried in the mausoleum, so that would have been, it was above ground.
Oh yeah, a lot more
space. She's in the wall. It would have been a wall too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it could be permeable. I guess, they could, if they opened the walls, if they slid you in like a drawer, there could be space for oxygen to get in sort of forever. That's sort of nightmarish.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely.
Which is, I guess, the point of a ghost story, isn't it? It's nightmarish.
It's exactly. I mean, what you're doing is you're flirting with some type of violent end and some kind of you're flirting with an untimely demise at a safe distance. I mean, that's what ghost stories are, right?
Indeed. I found that a lot of urban legends are really nothing more than ghost stories either.
Right.
Some of them are barely urban legends, like the repeating hitchhiker. I mean, that's not really urban. That's more suburban and, highway between the urban. But, are there any that are sort of what's called Southern Gothic legends that have made their way into the world of urban legends? Like is like, say, Candyman, from a Southern origin?
Well, if you count Virginia and all, got the Bunny Man out there, right?
Sure.
You got, most of these turn into that. We got Hug and Molly down in Alabama, which was purportedly a tall 7-foot woman who there's several variations of it, but a tall 7-foot woman who would come out at night, and she would come, and if children were not home yet, she would come out and she would hug children and scream in their ears. And it's called Hug and Molly. There's a little restaurant down there that bears the name and continues this kind of urban legend. And there's a little more to it that she's searching for a lost child, some variations on it. Some of the urban legends obviously revolve around more cryptid-like things as well. Outside of Louisville, Kentucky, there's something called the Pope Lake Monster, which is a goat man who purportedly lives out at Pope Lake Creek underneath a railroad trestle. And the whole legend goes that he was born half man, half goat. His mother didn't know what to do with him because he had these little hooves, and so she, of course, brought him on down to the circus and dropped him off in a basket at the circus. And
sure.
Well, we could make a buck off of this guy.
You betcha.
Sideshow, right? Well, one night as they're leaving Louisville after a week or whatever on the circus, and they're crossing this bridge over Public Creek, this big trestle bridge. It's the middle of a storm, and lightning strikes the bridge right as the railroad's crossing, and the train comes crashing down. The Public Monster flees to safety, and everyone in the circus dies. And the Public Monster has lived under this bridge ever since. This is product of who knows what. A goat man, half goat. Much like every other goat man. I guess there's one up. There's one up in Maryland, right? The goat man up there. And of course, but the thing about this particular urban legend that makes it just extra scary or just extra upsetting and unnerving is, it's become a part of the legend, of course, to go out there, and people say that this goat man uses voice mimicry to lure people out onto the tracks, onto the railroad tracks, and that's how they get killed, right? That became part of the legend. And unfortunately, people have bought into this. And so in the past, 30, 20 years, there have been people who've gone out to find the goat man at night and gone up on that trestle bridge and have actually been killed because of him. There's been several deaths. One as recently as 2017. Some teenagers went up there on the bridge, and it's still an operating railroad. It's a long trestle bridge, so if you go out there, you cannot outrun the train.
So they're being killed by the train. They're not being killed by mysterious. I mean, it's
but, the legend, of course, evolved into he's using voice mimicry to lure you onto the tracks where you're getting killed there. So this urban legend kind of evolved into this other thing, but it becomes dangerous. Some of these urban legends become dangerous because of that.
There's a couple lessons we have here, and I cannot tell you how many times I've tried to warn people. I'm sure you've warned your audience too. You cannot domesticate a satyr. It's just not. It just can't be done. Satyrs are not pets, so you need eons of training to do that. Ask Dionysus; he'll tell you. The other thing is, I cannot rule out, based on this tale, that the goat man has not decided that he's tired of having sore throats, trying to get Ludens and Ricola and whatever, and he's just letting the train do his hunting for him, and that cooked food tastes better than raw food under the bridge. So, maybe the goat man is in fact still there, and he's just found a more caloric preserving method of hunting. So,
he's probably old by now, right? He doesn't want to go chasing anybody down.
That's an excellent point. I don't know how goat people age. I don't know if they they age like goats. I don't know if they all age like people, or if like satyrs, they're basically, immortal. So, and then, by the way, the goat man from Maryland, I mean, Kentucky and Maryland is a walkable distance, especially if you are, if you don't mind hoofing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Bad. Pun intended. All right. So that one fell a little bit flat. So, okay, good. Good on me. So, you had mentioned that there might be the first serial killer. Let's hear a little bit more about that.
Well, the Madame Lalaurie down in New Orleans, it's one of the people they like to bill as that. Now, if you call the first, that's quite a name to say the first serial killer in North America, right?
Sure.
But Madame Lalaurie, she was back in the early 1800s. She was a French Creole socialite down in New Orleans. Her family had owned a plantation down there. She was born in North America. She was born in a French colony, right? And of course, that was sold to the United States. So she was continuing to live as this kind of socialite Creole down in what now was an American city, continuing to live this kind of upper class life down there with a lot of cash. She was on her third husband at this point in time. He was a gentleman. Lalaurie, he was a dentist, a failed doctor from France, came over here, was practicing dentistry. She owned this big house, of course, was among the social elite of town. And one day back, I believe, honestly, I don't even want to quote the year at this point, early 19th century, a fire breaks out at her home. Of course, she comes running out. Everybody's running out. Everybody's coming in to see the firemen going to help. It's notorious because they're going in to try and save the people because she had enslaved people working there for her, right?
Right.
And she was notorious in the newspapers because she of course told them, "Don't worry about them. I have fine art furniture in there.
Right, I've got stuff."
Right. Yeah. Well, what they do is they go inside and they're trying to save as many people as they can as this house is on fire. And when they make it up to the attic, they discover what is hands down, factually, historically documented, probably one of the most gruesome sights in the history of American slavery. Okay. Up in the attic space, there are men chained up there that they've been doing medical experiments on. I mean, men who are cut open, have had parts of their body sewn to different parts, just a gruesome sight, right? This is actually, some folks might remember the characterization of Madame Lalaurie in the American Horror Story show. There was a kind of a fictionalized version that Kathy Bates played, and just this gruesome sight, right? So, and this is factual. This isn't part of a ghost story or anything. This is what was found up there. Of course, immediately what she realizes is that she's in trouble here. Mm-hmm. She takes off. She skips town. She gets away, and purportedly gets back to France and never makes it back to New Orleans after that. But because of a lot of these crimes and everything, some people will claim for her, because of the deaths that happened and these things, that she might be one of America's first serial killers, certainly one of the first female. Now, whether you attribute it to her or not is up to debate. Another one, though, as we talk about these first serial killers, Charleston has one that for a long time folklore claimed that a woman by the name of Lavinia Fisher out in Charleston, she was hung, actually, for being a serial killer, purportedly, that is, right? And it was a woman out there who she had a house out on the edge of town, and purportedly what she was doing is she was working with highwaymen, right? And she was inviting people into this house, and renting out a room for the night, but killing them as they were kind of coming in. It was the 6 Mile Wayfarer house, so 6 miles outside of Charleston, right? So rent your room, poison the tea, it'll knock you out at night, then of course I'll murder you, keep the money. And there are stories, just some of the most dramatic stories about like the bed crash, like have a trap door in the beds to crash in, all these sorts of things. As H.H. Holmes as you can possibly make the stories. Folklore has gone through the years. Eventually, everybody's like, where are all these people going? And they make it out to Lavinia Fisher's place out of this house. And when they get out there and they arrest her and they bring her in, she's tried for the crimes. Her and her husband were tried for the crime. She's put away in the historic Charleston jail, which is just one of the creepiest buildings in the world. If you're ever in Charleston, you should go look at it. But she's in the jail. Even plans an escape out of the jail and everything. Finally, they go to hang her in downtown Charleston, right next to the courthouse. And she's in a white dress, and they ask her, do you have a confession to make? Is there any last words that you want to make before we hang you? And she tells them, if you have a message for hell, give it to me. I'll deliver it. Mm-hmm. Right in front of the crowd. Doesn't want to confess to anything. So she's gone down as this, like, historically, again, much like Madame LaLaurie down in New Orleans, is possibly, one of the first serial killers. But for Lavinia, it's very hearsay. It is very much likely she did not murder anyone or anything. Whereas LaLaurie is a very documented. There was horrific things going on inside her house at that point in time. And that's in the French Quarter. Nicolas Cage actually owned that house for a little while.
Of course he did.
He purchased, yeah, exactly. It's a private house. It's still there today. It's a beautiful, beautiful house.
I mean, between him and Billy Bob Thornton, they were probably bidding on it.
Right.
I'm sorry, I got the two women mixed up. Yes, they both have L names, but her arrangement with what was her arrangement with the highwaymen? Because she was doing the killing and she was keeping the money. Were they just sort of like chasing people so that they felt that they needed to get respite, and they would see her, I guess, pub or tavern or whatever, and go, oh, that's safety. Then they go away, and she'd split the money with them, so their hands were clean.
Well, she's supposedly part of a gang.
Okay,
right, and this was a stand, if you will. The same stories are kind of on like Natchez Trace and some other areas, in and out of town. We've got a lot of stories of people who supposedly had these little inns where they catered to travelers and murdered them.
So they're familiars.
A lot of ghost stories down here about those.
So like Dracula's Romane or familiar, witches familiars, whether they're her gang of what was Robin Hood's merry men. These are something akin to merry men, except psychotics. But they didn't want to do the killing themselves, so they let the bad lady do it. Okay, I can dig it. All right, so what else we have in terms of a little bit macabre, but a little bit supernatural?
A little supernatural. Well, since we're out in Charleston, I just visited. There's some wonderful stories out there. But if you ever visit Charleston, they have this really unique architectural piece that they do, where if you look up at the porches of all these houses, it doesn't matter how rich and fancy or how small and poor somebody might be. If you look at the the ceiling of a porch, 9 times out of 10, if not more, it's painted with this color blue that's kind of this water blue, right? And aqua, and they call it hate blue. Okay, and it's this color that supposedly stops spirits from entering the house. And it's really well known around Charleston. They say, on one hand, it might be that spirits, they're afraid of water, so they stay away. On the other, they just think it's the sky when they come to the house. They just
camouflage.
Here, right? And it's a way that, and this is an old Gullah and Geechee tradition, okay, which are the enslaved population that were out there on the Sea Islands for a long time and lived in that area. And this culture had these tales about this one type of spirit called the Boo Hag. Okay, and the Boo Hag was just this awful creature that they say what it looked like is it looked like a skinless person, like a golem or something, right? Without skin, just muscles exposed, hair, beady eyes, just gross, slimy creature that supposedly would sneak into people's houses at night while they're sleeping and then get up on people's chest and they would suck the life out of their breath. Okay, and it's a very common thing. Down there, there's a phrase called "Don't let the hag ride you." So if you wake up in the morning really tired, clearly a boo hag got it. But most of the time they tell this story about the boo hag that these creatures would hide themselves by taking the skin of one of their victims and wearing it like a suit over themselves. And a very common story is they would wear the skin of a beautiful woman that come into a small town out there and of course, attract a man to come in and marry and they would live with this gentleman and This gentleman would, of course, fall in love with this beautiful woman who would take care of him and every night would feed him and tuck him into bed and everything, right? Just make sure that he was very happy. The second he'd fall asleep, he'd slip off and disappear, right? And would go and do that. Well, according to most people, what would happen is this gentleman, he would see that all his friends were starting to get sick in town, but he wasn't. And he might start noticing that something's going on with his wife. So he'd go in search of it. And root workers around that point in time, of course, would tell him, right? They would let him know, if you want to get rid of this boo hag, this is what you have to do. You need to go home, you need to pretend like nothing happened. You need to pretend to fall asleep. And as soon as that boo hag kind of slides out at the end of the night, you got to get some paint. And you got to go get some haint blue paint. As soon as the boo hag's out, you go and put it around all the windows, all the entrances, and block that boo hag. Then you need to go inside and you need to find where that skin suit is. And you need to make sure that you salt down the inside of that skin suit. So when that boo hag comes back, if they slip inside, they get back in, and they go put the skin on, of course it's going to cause problems for them, And so this was the way that a gentleman would get rid of it. So when the boo hag would come home, the boo hag would try and get in the house. If it couldn't, it got stuck outside in the sunlight, a lot like a vampire. That sunlight would just...
So the salting was what plan B, if it still managed to get in.
Plan B, absolutely. So, some people, I've heard some storytellers talk about it, about how, a story about a man, he would paint all the windows, but what he didn't realize is he forgot the basement window at the bottom. And he'd go inside and he would wait, and then all of a sudden he'd hear a crash, and the boo hag can't get in, make it inside.
So he never...
Go to put the skin suit on.
He never noticed his girlfriend didn't go out during the day?
Well, she would be wearing a skin suit.
Oh, okay. It was protection. Okay, very good. Yeah.
She was pretending to be this beautiful woman. So, but the boo hag it's a product of this old Gullah Geechee culture that's been around for years, and what that was is very similar to like what voodoo culture is in some ways, right? It was the enslaved population of African communities that were in an isolated area and were able to maintain certain elements from their homeland, and the boo hag was a product of that.
Sure. Well,
again, if you go out to Charleston, you'll see remnants of this community and that hate glue on the porches.
Yeah, you've got your revenant and your skinwalker all in once, and the hag. I mean, there's a witch, so there's the skinwalker is sort of a universal kind of thing. I'm not sure if the skinwalker is always a skin wearer, but I can't say it's not.
It's a unique hag type. But when you talk about like hag symbolism, it's a little who's a Baba Yaga, a little less that the African traditions usually have the hags a little more like they're a little meaner, a little tougher, a little more vampiric.
Right. Yeah. They take care of business, aggressively. A little bit less of tricking you into the forest and then putting you in a stew or something. I get it. The salt. So. The salting, would that just like burn the heck out of the body? Is that basically what we're talking about?
Just slide it on and want to rip it right back off. So the idea would be if she put it on and she had to rip it off, then she'd have no skin to wear in the sunlight.
Oh, okay. So it would rip off her whatever her version of dermis was. Or
exactly.
It would
exactly.
Gotcha. So she could no longer fit on her. It's not that the salt itself would kill her. It's that the salt would make it sticky, and then when she took it off, she'd rip off all her protection, and she'd have nowhere to go. She'd have to stay indoors all the time. Is there any other way to kill her? Like, do you drive a stake through her head? Do you cut her head off? Do you make boo hag jerky out of her and feed her to pigs?
I don't know of any other ways to kill her. I know that one of the ways you can protect yourself, though, aside from the hate blue, is it's kind of got that traditional, and you'll hear this about other cryptids and other things as well, is putting a straw broom out your front door, right? Because you have to count the bristles. Right. I'm sure you've heard that in legends. And
count rice or grains of dirt or whatever that.
They've got those as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I find that one to be hysterical. Where a vampire basically is unstoppable, but if you throw in like a bunch of grains of rice down on and they better stop and count them. I mean, where that even came from, I don't know, because vampire is sort of a European thing, and rice sort of came from the East. So I mean, yeah, I'm not sure which came first, the vampire story or the rice, but it seems like a strange thing. But apparently, dirt and bristles on brooms work as well.
Yeah.
These seems like very easy ways to dissuade supernatural. Well, I guess first you have to figure out there's a supernatural creature. Second, you have to survive the supernatural creature. Then you've got to get around to doing this. So it's. I mean, it is its own little hero's journey, I guess. Or fool's journey, whichever way you look at it. Either way. So yeah, I think the Buhag that's pretty terrifying. And has there been a movie or something in pop culture about a Buhag?
I'm sure. I don't think I've ever looked or watched a Buhag movie, but yeah, I'm sure they're out there.
What have you read, watched, either movie or TV, and seen and said, I know this story, they got it right, and on the other side, I know this story, God, they really got it wrong, they butchered it?
As we're talking about voodoo, I mean, that's gotten a really bad rap in media.
Oh, sure.
Like something like the Skeleton Key, when that came out, that was a pretty rough one. Most of what I struggle with are some of the TV shows that'll go out there and do ghost hunts at places. They always seem to lean into the more like evil elements or something, right? I mentioned earlier Julia Brown, who was the supposed voodoo practitioner who destroyed this town, and that legend. There've been some folks who've done TV shows out there and just made her into this evil woman who had a bone to pick and destroyed southeast Louisiana with a hurricane. And I think that's become like a vast mistreatment of someone who originally the tale started that this woman was warning the town, and that's what local lore originally was, or we believe it probably originally was, but she was warning the town that something was going to happen. So most of them are TV shows. Yeah, I mean, I've seen some really bad.
You're talking about like ghost hunters and paranormal investigators. Those kinds of stuff.
Unfortunately, I can't say that there are too many that I've seen do a fantastic job. Every now and then there'll be a nice one. Some of the documentaries do okay. There's shock docs that are on Discovery Channel. Some of those have been okay when it comes to history and what's real and what isn't. There's a show called Atlas of Cursed Places that came out and really only made a handful of episodes. It was pretty well researched. I believe it's on Disney Channel or Disney Plus now. Unless there's a National Geographic one. That one had a really, really good research to it. Or at least the ones I was familiar with. But movie-wise, I mean, nobody. That's all up in the air. That's all stereotypes. Nobody's really doing a great job. Yeah.
I've been to a bunch of southern cities, near. Well, either the shore or, a major river or whatever. And a lot of them seem to have basically a variation of the same statue, a woman basically waving a handkerchief or a towel or something. And, the story is always the same that, she was waiting for her lover, a sailor, to come back from war or a trip. Never did, threw herself into the sea, but she walks these piers. And every city claims her as their own. Which, that seems like a sort of classic ghost story. Is there some origin story of that where that came up? And is there any particular city that can actually claim where this actually occurred or occurs? Or is it just a thing that everyone sort of does for tourists?
I mean, I would say that is a very archetypal type of story, right? And what I noticed in the South, I know of a couple of those, but is I joke, we really like dead brides here. It doesn't matter what city you go to. For some reason, there's a woman who was either her fiance died before her wedding day. she didn't want to get married and decided to throw herself downstairs or off a bridge herself, or something of that nature. And just like the woman who threw herself into the sea is, unfortunately, this poor woman is forced to mourn a man for eternity. And, it's everywhere. The town I live in now, we have a woman who hung herself the night before her wedding. They're everywhere. And it's such a prominent cliche of this like blonde hair, blue-eyed, heartbroken, or, died through heartbreak is so common that even like when William Faulkner bought his house in the 1920s, when he bought Roanoke down in Mississippi, he made up a story about a woman who threw herself off of the balcony and killed herself because she fell in love with a soldier who wouldn't come. Who never came back. So it's so common, but there are some that wildly enough are true every now and then, which is what makes it so hard to invalidate them, because it really, like 99% are just archetypal made up stories like Faulkner, or, maybe it's not made up, but it is, it might have this tiny kernel of truth, but it is made up. But there are some, down in there's one called The Bride of Annandale, down in Mississippi, at the Chapel of the Cross Church. There's purportedly a woman who was crying over lost love in the cemetery, sitting on this wrought iron bench, crying over her beloved. She did not marry him. He was killed in a duel before her wedding, and now she sits there and she mourns much the same way you describe in this cemetery to this very day. And that one is a historically accurate story when it comes down to it. Versus the one that I have in town here is entirely made up, and so it's almost a variation on that Lady in White you were discussing, the hitchhiking Lady in White. Right. It is almost as common as that.
Which is like La Llorona and the Wailing Woman or the White Woman. I mean, it is
exactly
very archetypal, and then I guess some of those are about lost children as opposed to a lost love. But I mean, to an extent, love is love, right? I mean,
right.
And on Love is Love, are there any stories down there in your jurisdiction that have to do with sort of ghost animals? I have a little working theory. Now, I feel safe in having this discussion with you because, obviously, you must at least be open to ghosts being real. So, ghosts are usually tied to a place or a person or a family. I mean, that tends to be the two types of families of ghost stories. There might be others, but that's usually it. And it's usually tied to some type of trauma. Lost love is a big one, or some sort of traumatic death, something horrific that in life you partook in, were the victim of, saw, couldn't get over. I don't believe that should be limited to humans. I see no reason why there's not animals. If you were a dire bison or giant sloth and you were like being, driven down cliffs by Neanderthals or Navajo or whatever, that, or whoever, it doesn't matter who, that mastodons, that you may not have trauma associated with the place and you might not have a ghost. Or if you were a Neanderthal or some sort of Australopithecus and it was Homo sapiens doing it to you, or the lions got the best of you that day, or your family, they might have ghosts, and those ghosts might be your Bigfoot or your devil dog or your werewolf. That you might actually be seeing the ghost of a dire wolf and think it's a werewolf or whatever. So listen, this is not an actual theory. This is just something putting out there for fun. I'm not trying to do a dissertation or get a PhD on this or win a Nobel Prize as to, I've solved, everything about all cryptids. They're just ghosts of extinct, hominids and other, unicorns or Siberian rhinoceri, or rhinoceroses, etc. But are there any sort of ghost stories down there that might fit into my hypothesis, or even if my hypothesis is garbage, still exist?
I mean, I have heard many stories about ghost dogs. Some evil, some not. Obviously the black dog of death has a lot of variations around here. I don't know. I'm trying to think. I know Charleston in the dog route, right? But that's more man's best friend, right?
It's okay.
There's the Poogan's Porch restaurant down there in Charleston has out front, they have a little tomb or a little burial site of the dog Poogan that that was owned by the family there, and people who eat there say sometimes they'll feel like Poogan goes right around between their feet. I know that I know several stories of that nature, and I've heard some stories over the years about like a Lassie type thing where a dog saves somebody, and then you find out that the dog had died with the person, or you get the drift. But I don't know of any that really would really support. It's probably more just I haven't looked more into that type of haunting. But I will say I appreciate the idea. I know people really enjoy making somebody like Bigfoot and believing like Bigfoot could be that interdimensional or spirit type creature. I don't buy that.
I don't either, but
not because I don't like ghosts, but because I want Bigfoot to be real.
Right, Bigfoot is sort of like a relative of man, or that link between man and ape is much more interesting than making him this all powerful interdimensional thing. Right. However, the ghost thing does explain the interdimensional confusion, or not confusion, accuracy. It's just not that they're going through a Stargate or a space portal or whatever. They're just not corporeal.
It's interesting. Yeah, I don't know a lot of animal stories other than some dog ones, and they're always that just really they're kind of cutesy.
Well, now you have like 3 or 4 years more content that I've just given you to look into, so you're welcome. Yeah. No, I really like my little musing. I'm going to stop calling it hypothesis because it's not, but it's just a little thought that's funny. I had another one that's not related to the show at all. But here's my last question, I think. Are there stories about giants?
Oh gosh, I don't know of any big ones here. Now, in Apalachia and all, they've got a lot of stories that are similar to that. I'm not really super familiar with them.
I see all the time stories about the Mound cultures and the Mississippians and the giant snake. I'm going to call them petroglyphs, but I guess they're not in stone, so they're not petroglyphs. Right. But I mean, all of that's in the South. But I've spoken to, I don't know, 2 dozen people who sort of do variations on what you do, whether they're cryptid hunters, whether they're involved in paranormal, whether they're involved in voodoo or other paranormal, and none of them seem to make a big deal of this. This is nothing they've ever brought up. It's always people from somewhere else, Australia, England, the North, the worst of all, where I am, the North, talking about these things as if it's something paranormal, not just a burial method. Is there anything to the Mound culture that has more of a paranormal implication in the Southern Gothic realm?
Appalachia has a lot of stories that would fall into similar things. I think a lot of that comes because the folks who settled out there were Scott-Irish culture, and so when they got out there, they probably brought with them a lot of those kind of the old world lens to view, this new terrain. But honestly, some of the things that there's a group called the Moon-Eyed people that supposedly live out there. They weren't giants, but it was like albino type creatures, and there are cultures like that have talked about. I've always read into them less in the paranormal realm and more in kind of like the UFO realm.
Oh yeah, the Moon-Eyed people definitely sound like the Greys.
That's always more when I would read into that stuff. If we were to look at it, it was either more just an anthropological thing in the way they would say Bigfoot, is a real, being, and we've just kind of lost, what it is, missing link type thing. I've always read this kind of Moon-Eyed people, those giants, things of that nature. Like these were just genetically a different, part of either our species or something, or I've read it as that kind of extraterrestrial, which I don't usually get into with my research and what I do. I stick more to the ghost type stuff and that paranormal. So I don't get too deep into the kind of UAP world and the extraterrestrial. Fascinated by it, but I'm by no means an expert to talk about it.
Okay, that's not your lane. Mazel tov for not being dragged into those lanes. I don't know how you avoided it.
Well, I love it. I mean, I'm not going to lie. It's again, talking like Bigfoot and the obviously, I grew up watching In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy.
Me too. He was the In Search Of guy before he was Spock to me.
I mean, oh man, yeah, like Coast to Coast and all. I mean, I am fascinated by all of it. But I do, I can't, I'm no, what's his name? Dr. Meldrum that does the big, I do not have the knowledge base whatsoever to be able to, give real honest answers. Everything I do is very much more the kind of ghost-oriented.
Let me ask you something that is clear in your wheelhouse, because you mentioned it on more than one occasion, and it's definitely going to fill a void in my knowledge base, because I don't know what this means when you say it exactly. I mean, and so you've mentioned a couple times that people brought this Scotch-Irish view or lens with them. I don't know much about Scots. I mean, I know the Fey folk, and I know that there's some overlap, or there was some blending with sort of your Germanic, Russian, Nordic, and Celtic, religions at some point. The Druids and the Odin and Gandalf and Merlins and all. Well, Gandalf is later, but he's just Merlin basically. And what. When you say that Scotch-Irish lens, what do you mean?
Yeah, well, most of what, when I talk about old stories, and I talk about, especially here in the South, they always seem to have some type of tie back to the old world. So when folks came, when folks settled in North America, in the South in particular, the people who were settling the swamps of Louisiana, they came from France. So they brought with them this kind of culture and this background and superstitions and all these things that were French. So, we end up with the Rougarou, which was like a vampire, or not a vampire, so a werewolf kind of creature in the swamp. Well, the French had Lebet. So they basically, their lens, I guess is what I'm saying, is they had this cultural fear of werewolves. So when they got here and they were in the swamps and they saw things they didn't understand, they were kind of using this old kind of, folklore. So the Scotch-Irish, which they were the ones who settled Appalachia, so Scottish and Irish culture, right? And they had their own kind of view from the old world, which is hundreds of years. I know, as my Irish friend says, he tells me, man, you can't walk around Ireland without a rock having some type of story from 800 years ago. That's just how they are as a people, right? So, but when the Scotch-Irish came over and they found, that East Coast over there was all just British at that point, right? And so they were forced further inland, and that's how they ended up in Appalachia. So they ended up in those mountains, in those really isolated regions. So what you had these old world, basically clans and tribes of these people who were very self, able to just take care of themselves, very isolated. They didn't need the outside world. They were very rough, very rugged, very capable of it. And they were in this new, beautiful, lush terrain that is the Appalachian Mountains. But they had this culture that they had learned that had gone back for hundreds of years, that involved, like you're saying, Fey folk, and it involved all these old world things. And so they brought those ideas to a new terrain, and then we had almost a new life was brought into it. A similar way to the Buhag, even we talked about that earlier. That was almost an evolution of some types of hags that were in African cultures. But here, when it came to North America, it evolved into something that was more North American and unique. So that's kind of what I mean by that, the Scotch-Irish stuff in Appalachia.
So the Morrigan became a witch.
Yeah. It's just as things evolved, and it would fit its own kind of thing. I go back to the Rougarou because I just think it's most people can picture it better. As you have French people who were then forced to live in the swamp. Right? You picture French people out there, medieval France, and there's wolf problems. So they believe in werewolves. And then all of a sudden you just plop them down with alligators and snakes and stuff. well, now they have this weird swamp werewolf. You know,
Right.
like that to me is a great picture of it. Whereas, you know, some of the other cultures, it's a new environment. There's new things to be afraid of. There's new creatures. There's new way of living.
New things that are trying to kill you.
Yeah, but yet you still know the stories from your ancestors and know how they viewed the world.
You try to retrofit your new discoveries. It's oh yeah, that's a sea dragon. That's they are be Leviathan or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what it is. So you kind of see that, and the South is just chock full of them, because as we kind of started, you know, coming full circle, that's when we had so many different people from so many different places all just mash into this one.
Yeah, well, it is an estuary of peoples as well as everything else.
Yeah.
So it's. I mean, isn't that what Creole means? Is just like a whole mixture of people.
Yeah, it's by definition, what it was is you were born in a colony,
right?
You know, and then just along the way, what it became was you were, you know, had some kind of French ancestry in the colonies here. So.
Right. What is either Creole or Cajun? One of those words basically means melting pot, you know, or melting pot with spice. I'm not sure which. Anyway, that's fine. So anyway, is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you, or anything that you are dying to tell me that you haven't before we get into your plugs?
No, man, this has been wonderful. This has been a great cross section of a lot of what we do, and you know, it's been fun, kind of, you know, going from New Orleans to Charleston up into the mountains today, haven't we?
Yeah.
All the way up to DC and talk to Arlington even.
That's right. We did the full rhombus. So yeah, we bounced around in history. All right, very cool. Well, thank you, Brandon. Tell them a little bit about where they can find you, where they can find your show, how they can support you.
Yeah, you can listen to Southern Gothic on all your podcatchers, wherever you listen to this podcast. You can find us. It's Apple, Spotify, Castbox, Amazon Music. You can also go to our website. It's southerngothicmedia.com.
Very cool. Do you have an outro song that you like? Anything that says like Southern and ghosty?
No, actually, you know, it's just I just have some good old fashioned swampy guitar playing on ours. Yeah.
I'll find something. In my head right now I have Harvest Moon, but I feel like maybe that's a little bit slow, and then it's not quite there, but I'll find something. All right, everyone. Thank you very much. Check out Brandon's work. Check out Southern Gothic. Make sure to support him. And hey, maybe you'll give him a subscribe, a like, a rating, and a review. And while you're at it, do the same for this show. And I'm sure both Brandon and myself would appreciate those personal referrals, because that's probably the best way to grow an audience. And thank you very much for listening, and you'll hear from us again next week in the Garden of Doom.
Always wanting more. He leave you longing for please.